Welcome to the On Garden Design podcast with Fleur and Sachi, where we chat about what makes a garden great and we try to inspire and make designing accessible to anyone who is interested in gardens, plants and chatting. Your hosts are longtime friends Fleur and Sachi, who bring a fresh perspective and their life experience to designing gardens as a second career. Hi Fleur. How are you doing?
Hi Sachi, it's good to be back in episode 2 today.
It is indeed. And what are we talking about today?
Well, it's a topic that I often get asked about, and that's about which landscaping professional is right for your project.
I think I could have used this when I was building my house, but for builders.
You know, quite possibly. I think a lot of people find this space quite confusing because they don't do this regularly. Usually as a, kind of, I guess, a normal person, you only really build a house or build a garden once.
Yes.
Or maybe if you're doing it a second time, there's been a big gap between when you last did it and you're doing it again.
Isn't it a bit like pregnancy and birth? You've forgotten by that time all the pain you went through.
Absolutely.
And of course, it's one of those things that when I think back to and it wasn't that long ago that I built my house, but really garden designers weren't such a big thing then. It's actually a reasonably newish profession, I think, or that's one at least that's accessible for, I don't know, the general public, because all of those shows, I don't watch them, the block, all of those things that are about your garden and your house and redoing it and, doing it in 5 seconds flat with no money and all of those things, they really have brought this emphasis, I guess, on the places we live in and what they look like. And gardens have been a big part of that as well. So things have really changed, I guess, over the last at least 10 years.
Yeah, look, you are right. There's been this sense that garden designers are now accessible and also that people can DIY their projects at home. There's a lot more books, there's a lot more YouTube videos, there's a lot more
Bunnings workshops.
There's a lot of Bunnings workshops. There's a lot of how-to everywhere. And the idea that people also are investing in their backyards like they've never done before.
Yeah.
And that's a really big shift in how we use our outdoor spaces. And, of course, in COVID, that became – I've never been busier because all that income, I suppose, that other people were thinking, I'll just go on those holidays, but now all of a sudden I've got this. I'm going to employ a garden designer to make my own patch beautiful.
Because the home environment became such an important part of where you were. Absolutely. I felt so sorry for those people in squidgy little apartments in inner city locations where they had no green, because I have to say my garden kept me sane through COVID, absolutely.
Yeah.
So why are we talking about this? Just give me a potted summary of why it's important.
Yeah, look, it's really important because every client project's different. And every client needs to employ the right professional for their particular project.
Like anything. Like you're not going to go to your doctor to get the tooth out. You go to your dentist.
Absolutely. But
I'm good with these analogies, I tell you.
I would never have made that analogy, but, that's great because there'll be a lot of people who can relate to that.
That's right. And so one of the things that I struggled with when I was sort of looking at this, and in fact when I was thinking a long time ago, gee, I'd love to be a landscape architect, it was really unclear to me what is the difference between landscape and garden insofar as it's used in the context of these professionals, that do things in your landscape or your garden.
Yeah, garden is very much about plants. And when people think about gardens, they're immediately they have green plant flowers.
Yep.
That sense
stuff.
Grass. Yeah, they think of the soft stuff. They think of what we call softscaping in the industry,
yes.
Which is the garden. And then we talk about landscape. We're talking about the garden as an element of the large outdoor space. So that large outdoor space will have plants in it. It'll also have hardscaping and it will have other elements as well.
So the sculptures, it might be your benches and your deck and whatever else might be out in as part of. So it's the whole, effectively.
It's
the garden is part of the whole.
That's right. That's how I'm thinking of it. So when you look at the different titles that professionals in this industry have, they tend to either have a garden in their title or they have landscape in their title, and that gives you an indication of the different focus points that they have.
And now I'm smiling because if then you describe yourself as a garden designer, you don't just deal in garden bits, which is the plant bits. So this is confusing.
It is a confusing space, and so that's why it's really good to talk about today.
Yeah, absolutely. So how about we start with, how do you go about this? How do you work out who the right person is, and knowing what it is that, you might need from someone?
Yeah, well, I think it's important that we go through the different categories, general categories, and of course there'll be subsets of these, and so you can get a sense of where the crossover in those roles are, and also so you're thinking about what's the complexity or the scope of my job, therefore who am I really after in this space.
Okay, so how about I ask you a question?
Sure.
I have a hedge which is dodgy. I've got thrips. And it's just not doing that.
It's really unfortunate that you have thrips, Sachi.
I know.
Should you see your dentist about that?
Doesn't it? Generally, got thrips in Fishwick. No, so everyone in Canberra has been suffering from this because we've had so much rain. So it's just not looking like it should. It's lost all its leaves. There's these little tufty bits that just look like very average. Who do I call?
Ghostbusters.
I knew you'd say that as soon as I said that. Okay, I'm going to call Ghostbusters, and then who do I call?
Yes, then you call a horticulturist.
Right.
So
what do they do?
Right. So horticulturists, they are qualified professionals who specifically understand the life and cycle of plants, and they understand why the plants are getting pests and diseases.
Yep.
They know how to treat. They know...
So they're the ones that know how to use Roundup versus some systemic thing or a horticultural oil.
Absolutely. They will be able to diagnose the plant and treat it accordingly.
Yep.
Think of them as the doctors of the plant world. Perhaps also the dentists of the plant world. And the obstetricians of the plant world. They propagate and I guess do things like introduce new cultivars of species. They do all sorts of amazing things with plants. It's very clever.
Yes. Okay. And so horticulturists would also potentially, if I wanted someone to come in and prune a tree, would they do that?
Well, a horticulturist generally can prune a tree because they've got a good understanding of that.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yes, that's right. And also, for example, if you had a problem with a tree which needed to be treated, then a horticulturist would be able to inject the tree or trim or do whatever they need to keep that tree in its best healthy condition.
Okay. And so what else would I call a horticulturist in to do in my garden potentially? Now I'll put you on the spot.
That's right. Yeah, no, a horticulturist is... So really, the horticulturist is the professional that you want to give you advice about your specific plants. So if you had an area that you wanted to be replanted and, the garden bed that you just thought, I really need some good suggestions on plants that will work well in this space, that will work in that orientation, that type of soil, and have this sort of look about them, or hardiness or natives, exotics, whatever you want that's important to you, then a horticulturist can really give you that advice.
Mm-hmm. So if my vegetables weren't growing right in my veggie patch, for instance, I could call a horticulturist in to say, hey, what's going on here?
You could, but that might also be an overkill because there's a lot of advice on, there's a lot of different avenues.
I don't want to do horticulturists out of a job.
But, things like vegetables, there are some fabulous resources online, and a lot of that stuff is self-help. There's also a group of people I think of as committed fiddlers.
I am a committed fiddler, so I would never call a horticulturist in for my veggie patch. I was just trying to come up with something that, because actually that's probably more likely to be a soil issue anyway than it is your plant issue. And I was trying to get a sense of, is that the kind of thing a horticulturist would also look at if you had something where you just had been trying and you just couldn't get anything to grow. I have a patch like this in my front garden and, I kind of got to the end of my tether. Could I call in a horticulturist to help me?
You certainly could.
Yeah.
A horticulturist has all those skills and more. So I think if you're thinking about you need a horticulturist to come in and solve the fact that your spinach isn't doing so well this year and it did really well last year, then you're probably being over-serviced with a horticulturist. However, if you've got a really significant tree that you want to have some assessment on, if you want some advice on proper pruning, if you need a general rethink about your plant selection, then the horticulturist is just the right person to really provide that advice for you.
Okay, perfect. So moving on, I've got this really crappy retaining wall that I need to rebuild. Who am I going to call for doing that? Yeah. Not a horticulturist.
That's right. No, look, a horticulturist is really with your plant material. But when you're talking about purely hardscaping materials, this is where you need a landscaper. And the landscaper is somebody who understands materials. They understand the drainage and the effect of the weight of the earth and water behind that particular retaining wall. And they can rebuild that wall, fix it, point it, replace it, give you advice on certain materials that might be better.
And upsell me to another retaining wall that I might want to build somewhere else because that is clearly not working so well in my garden.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, and the landscapers as well. There's levels. There's levels within every one of these industries, but the landscaper will be able to build you a wall up to 1.2 metres. After that, if you're going any higher, then you'll need to have a structural engineer.
Oh, okay. That's interesting to know. And that obviously would vary state to state, I assume, because there'll be building regulations are a state-based thing.
Yes, there are building regulations, but I believe that's an Australian standard.
Oh, okay. So it's actually in a standard as opposed to a regulation necessarily.
Well, I believe so. I think that is pretty consistent. I mean, there are definitely different standards across different states, and I think of that particularly with pool fencing. Mm-hmm. And that causes a lot of issues, and I find even the differences with Canberra application and New South Wales, because being in Canberra, I have many clients who are just over the border, and so I have to understand different council requirements when I go across the border. So
I guess one of the things is making sure that you're using a professional who is well versed in the regulations and requirements of that state.
That's really important. Right. And that's a good question to ask your landscaper when they come to your particular place, because some people in Canberra say, look, it's cheaper to get landscapers that are from New South Wales, and then you need to make sure that they're actually, one, they're licensed to work in ACT and that they understand the regulations and the differences in building codes in ACT.
Good tip, Flo. So I'm going to give you another scenario. I've just built a new house. What do I need? Who do I need?
Well, this is when this
is a Dorothy Dixer, isn't it?
That's right. This is my little bag. So this is where you've got this great vision. You've got your building plans. It's all gone through, and the build's all honky dory. It's all the decisions are made, but then you've got this big bit of space around your house. This is where the landscape designer or the garden designer, really, they're often the same thing. But landscape design is probably the official term, and the landscape designer will come in and meet with you, talk you through what your functions and practical applications, as well as a style and your tolerance for gardening, what you want in your outdoor spaces, and pull that together and make a plan for you.
So would a landscape or garden designer also think about designing a pool into my garden? So they'll go into, what I'm asking is, will they do the hardscaping stuff?
Yes, and the landscape designer will often clearly landscape designer is not implementing the build. They're not.
So they don't do the building?
The design phase itself is separate to the construction phase. Now, some landscape designers work in companies where they will do a design and then part of their company does the build. Other landscape designers like myself will provide the design to the client, and then the client can go to tender and choose a landscaper that is going to implement the project, which is like a separate contract.
So again, you need to be asking your garden designer, landscape designer, or your landscaper which bits they will do. So tell me about, because there are obviously landscapers out there that don't necessarily have design qualifications who are also going to put in something in your garden.
Yeah, that's really, it is a good...
I see lots of rows of pyrrhus and liriope, which I think, and lamandra, which probably come from these situations.
Yeah, look, landscapers are professionals at implementing the construction of the garden or the landscape. They do the hardscaping. They build the walls, they do the paving, they put the pebbles down, they prepare garden beds, they'll put the plants in. They're the doers. They're the builders of the garden. However, many times, or in many cases, the landscaping company don't have design qualifications, but through experience they might offer design services. And in that, you can expect an approach that is quite hardscaping heavy, because that's what they're very good at.
That's what they know.
That's what they know.
Yep.
And for a lot of clients, that
might work for them.
That might work for them. A lot of clients might say, look, just concrete the lot. I want that.
And then we'll paint it green.
That's it. Okay. Yeah. Or all I want is lawn and a hedge around the fence line. I mean, that's a classic.
That's an Australian backyard, particularly if you have kids and you want to play cricket.
That's right. And landscapers are absolutely capable of doing that design.
That's right. So it really goes to how much you want to invest in the design element of your garden, and someone who is thinking about plants from a design perspective as opposed to their health, which is the horticulturist, and the landscaper who's just thinking about how can I make something green potentially based on what I know.
Yes, I think that's a very fair observation. And I think the question as the client you need to ask yourself is how much involvement do I want in the project? Am I a creative person? Do I have the vision to see the garden that I want? And if I don't, then I need a designer.
Right.
If I have a vision that I can draw up a plan that a landscaper can implement, then maybe I just need a landscaper.
Particularly if you potentially know plants well and you've got a really clear idea of what plants you'd like in your garden as well. Otherwise, and plants go through trends, I've noticed, just like anything, hair and shoes. And you will often, I've noticed, particularly with new projects where a garden designer hasn't been involved, you will have the same as everyone else. And in fact, really good example, we were in Bowral in a new estate just recently, and when we were walking through the streets, pretty much every garden had the identical plant species in really similar straight lines everywhere.
Yes, and you do tend to see this idea of mass and block planting. It's become quite fashionable, particularly in apartment areas, complexes and estate planting. And it is, I guess, a simple approach. It's sort of this monoculture planting that it's quick to establish and it's usually evergreen. However,
probably cheaper too.
And cheaper. And it ticks the requirement according to the development application that says a certain amount of green space needs to be planted out. And so they tick the box with some very hardy, suitable plants, but in neat rows and perhaps easy to maintain, but not particularly aesthetically pleasing or providing a feeling of immersion and diversity, which is a lot of us are seeking now.
Absolutely. And I guess that's good if that's what you're after.
Yes.
And I think what you were saying before is the really critical thing. What is it that I'm looking for out of the professional? Am I looking for someone who is going to help me go on a journey with my garden? Or am I just looking for, effectively, someone else to build the garden like they might a pool or a pathway?
Yes, absolutely. The range of professionals out there can be confusing, but if you think about the scope and the complexity of your job and then look at the right professional for that fit.
Okay, now I'm going to throw another one in. So what do landscape architects do?
Yeah, so landscape architects, what probably delineates the landscape architect from a landscape designer is that an architect has done the 4-year university degree. and then gets an accreditation process. It's a bit like how a lawyer gets accredited onto the bar.
with the College of Law, yeah.
That's right. And so the landscape architect is generally done the 4-year university degree at an accredited institution, and then becomes a member of certain professional organisations. Now, the architect, through that process of the degree, the landscape architect is tutored in the skill sets required to deliver large urban type of projects.
So more complex and public safety sort of focused, I guess, designs.
That's right. So you'll see landscape architects employed in redesigning parts of botanic gardens, for example, large parks and public gardens, in playgrounds where the safety standards are particularly important. In areas of urban regeneration, so taking wetlands and making them restored back to sort of original wetland and creating better drainage flows. So big urban projects. Also, you see landscape architects being sort of sometimes delving in the residential space, but usually in a larger sort of complex garden space.
And that's what I was going to ask you, because all of these, there's crossover. It's
Yes.
not black and white. There's shades of grey in everything. It's life. So it's the same in all of these professions. You get landscapers who will do some garden design. You'll get landscape architects who will also do some garden design, horticulturists that might step into garden design, garden designers who might also work with landscapers. So, and there's no real clear delineation. And so what we're trying to give people here is a bit of a sense of what the different elements are.
Yes, that's right. And, the tendency might say, well, I'm going to go for a landscape architect because they're the most qualified to come and do my garden. Well, of course, if someone is the most qualified, they're also the most expensive.
Of course. That's right. Going back to my health analogy, of course you're going to have the orthopaedic surgeon to do the broken leg, not your GP necessarily, and that's going to cost you more.
Yes. And when you look at the risk involved, you say, well, actually, I'm prepared to pay that extra.
Of course.
Yes. So if you've got a really high-end landscape project in your residential environment, then perhaps a landscape architect is appropriate. However, most people, a landscape designer is just spot on. And, that sort of smaller, more intimate approach might be just for you. And then for others, they
might just need a horticulturist to help them with the plants.
That's right. So it just depends on your level of skill set and how involved you'd like to be in the project. So a landscape architect would generally project manage that project through to completion.
Right.
So they'll come in, engage with you, have that initial consultation, draw up plans, and then have a company come and build that and oversee it, much like an architect does with the building company.
And that's what I was going to say. So cost is always one of those difficult things to talk about. So if you were sort of describing how, in orders of magnitude, the difference between employing, say, a landscape architect and a garden designer, and then what you might expect your landscaper to cost, is there any ballparks that you could kind of use?
Well, landscape architects, for a package for your residential garden, you may pay up to $15,000 to $20,000, and
so pretty much like what you might, it's at least a proportion of your house, if you're having an architecturally designed house.
Yes, and the landscape architect may also actually quote on a percentage of the build cost. Right. So if the garden's going to cost you $150,000, then they'll have a commission of 10%, so $15,000.
Okay, yeah.
And that's a typical kind of fee structure for a landscape architect. Landscape designers, this is where the crossover point comes in. Some landscape designers who also have connected with a company that does the building, then they may also take a proportion of the total build cost, because that's an indication of the complexity of the project.
Yep.
And so some landscape designers may also work on that fee structure, but other ones, like myself who works as a sole proprietor, I will have a set fee for doing a garden design, and that it ranges in the several thousands of dollars, and that depending on the size of the project, and that's sort of one-off fee, and then from there the client will engage a landscaper to build the plan.
Right, and it might not be connected at all to how much they've paid
Absolutely.
the garden designer. Because the other thing I was thinking about, back to this sort of there's no black and white between anyone, is that you can also go to a garden designer for other types of services. Like you can get plant design advice from a landscape designer or a garden designer, whatever you want to call them, rather than getting a full-blown garden design, and which is quite similar to what a horticulturist might also do.
That's right. So quite often, in fact, probably about a third of my clients just want a garden consultation. And so I'll walk through the garden with the client and we talk about what are the little fixes you can make. And we talk about the health of the plants. We talk about what could go there that's better, where the focal points are. There's a particular location for a good structure right here, a good sculpture. We should make this a little sitting space. It could look like this. And I can do some sketches. We walk and talk and we really examine their garden in their context, in their space, and really unpack that. And that might be all a client wants. And
you might be able to, you give them recommendations potentially on the plants themselves. So like a horticulturist might do.
Yes, of course. Yep. And quite often I'll be walking around with a notebook and I'll just sketch out and say, this garden bed, we can put this here, this.
Yeah.
These are the plant names. This is the sort of quantities you're after and the spacing. And then I walk away and I'll just leave them with that piece of paper.
Right. So if they're a keen gardener, they can go then off and do the DIY project, but with a bit of, I guess, more professional assistance, just mapping something out, because the conceptual piece can be the most difficult piece as well.
Yes, that's right. And often when I'm doing a garden consultation, it's not just about the plants. It's really about the flow of the garden, the layout, the feeling. The feel, that's right. It's like, how do you want your garden to feel? And in that, we say, look, it's really a very flat garden. We need to add some vertical interest, and we can do that by either putting a clump of trees in or by putting a vertical structure like an arbour with a sitting space.
Or a sculpture.
Or a sculpture.
Yes.
So they're the sort of things that I look at when I'm looking at the garden, is not just about what plant combinations to use, but what the whole feel and flow and layout of that garden should be.
Back to the holistic picture of the garden as opposed to just the plants or just the hardscape.
That's right.
Okay, well, I think we have covered that fairly substantially.
Yes.
What are 3 things you'd like to tell people, just to summarise and keep in mind what exactly it is that we've been talking about when they're thinking about their garden project and who they might need?
Yeah, look, the key takeaway is choose the right landscape professional for your project. And by doing that, you will have a good journey, because you will pay the amount of money that you want for the service that you get.
Sounds like good advice.
That's a good top takeaway.
Yep.
The second one is consider, do you want someone to just come and talk to you about ideas and maintenance, or do you want someone to come and construct and do it? And so if you know what you're after right up front, you can employ the right person for that job.
So that's probably for someone who has a bit more idea about planting and plants and a very clear conceptual idea of what they need.
That's right. That's
okay.
Right. And then the other thing you really need to know right up front for yourself is, how much am I going to be involved in this project? So therefore, what am I going to ask someone else to put into my garden that I can manage myself? And so know your own style, know your ability to maintain it. I'd
say that's not just ability, that's your enthusiasm for maintenance as well.
It's your capacity.
Of course.
Your ability to get down on your knees and prune stuff and
your
pull
lower back
things
strength.
Out. That's it. That's it.
Core strength, in fact.
And just know what sort of time you have to give to that.
That's right. That's right. And that's a big part of gardening, because your garden is never static. It doesn't matter how good the build is to begin. Your garden keeps evolving, and it will give you all sorts of things that you didn't anticipate.
That's right.
I think it's a great place to leave it. So what are we talking about next week?
Well, I think a really good flow on from this particular topic is understanding the garden design process.
Oh, that's a great idea. Absolutely. So this has been Who Do You Need? And Then if you've decided you need the garden designer, we'll talk about what process you might want to be thinking about to use, or what you can expect, I guess.
Yeah, really about managing your expectations. And in that, you might find there's enough tips to DIY your own garden design.
Perfect. That sounds like a plan. Well, we'll talk to you again.
Right. Lovely talking with you, Such.
It has been. See you later.
Bye then.